there, true believers, and welcome to another episode of Tier Talk, the series where I go over media franchises old and new to rate them based on my own experiences and preferences before your very eyes. As always, if you find this video entertaining, let me know with a big ol' thumbs up, and consider hitting the subscribe button for more geeky content from the Northeast Kingdom's biggest nerdy stuff lover. Without further ado, let's jump right into this list with today's topic of conversation: video game console controllers, specifically from the 3rd generation to the current 9th generation. Since my early adolescence, video games have been an important part of my lifestyle. I have faint but pleasant memories of using my dad and older brother's video games to pass the time, and since then I've become a collector and player of many different brands from many different generations. So today I thought I'd take the time to weave through the various shapes and sizes that make up the devices we use to entertain ourselves. All the mainstream consoles that I've personally used in my life, from the SEGA Master System all the way up to the more recent PS5, are on here, and I plan on being brutally honest with each iteration. Just remember, this entire list and the things I'll be talking about in this video are my opinion, so if there's a part of this video where you disagree or agree more, try not to roast me too hard in the comments. Or do, I don't really give a darn. Discussion is discussion. And with that, let's just get right into it, starting with the very first entry on this list with the classic Nintendo Entertainment System. Alright, so the NES. It's the NES. That's very classic, very easy thing to say, right? The Nintendo controller itself isn't all that much to write home about. It's very simplistic because, you know, video games were simplistic at this time, right? Like, you have your directional buttons that let you move, your start and select buttons, though I don't think it was called select. I don't remember what it was back then. Actually, I do. I have one sitting right in front of me. It is indeed called the select button. And this did exactly what you think it would do. Back then, the buttons on the controllers very literally did what they said on them. So in these two, in their case, the select button was what you used to choose something on a menu that you were going through, instead of using the A or the B button. So if you were to scroll a menu with the start button and you wanted to do something on the menu, you hit the select button afterwards. So control was very functional. It was simple, but it was functional. It did what it's supposed to do. That being said, I don't know how many of you guys have actually held an NES controller. This shit's unbearable to hold because it is angular and it is square and it is very flat. You can tell it was like made for a demographic of kids because the controller is small, the buttons are fairly large, and there's only a couple of them. So if I was an adult, and I am an adult holding it right now, these are very uncomfortable. I'm gonna go ahead and throw out of nostalgia, I want to rank it higher, but I think I'm going to put the Nintendo in the first, in the D category, just because of how small, how angular it is, and how, oh man, this is a fault in like video games, not in the controller itself, but the controller did different things depending on what game you're playing. Some Japanese games very literally used the start and select buttons to do stuff, whereas an American developer would probably use the A and B button to do stuff. So, but in just sheer terms of, yeah, it has a lot of high functionality, but this thing is angular and stupid and clunky to hold as an adult. So I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the D tier and call it a day. And I'm probably gonna put the Master System right in the same one because arguably these two are the same sort of spiel, right? Where like they have the direction buttons that did stuff, and then you had the A and B button, or they didn't call it the A B button, but you had the two face buttons over here that selected stuff and did things in your video games, but they were still about the same size and they were fucking rectangles, so they just didn't feel good in your hands. One thing that I think that the Master System did get right though is that these are buttons that pointed in your different directions, whereas the Master System kind of has what the Xbox Series has going on now, and the Steam Deck, is that they have rounded buttons on the inside in here, so that way your fingers would easily like get to one of each of them, and I think that was really ahead of its time. I don't know why we have all these angular buttons on all these new controllers and stuff like like that, probably because it was just super simple to make sure you're only tapping one, but this was smart. Like, I don't know why more controllers didn't do this, but I guess we'll figure it out as we talk about the rest of these, huh? And then the Super Nintendo controller. This one is probably just an automatic C tier because it's literally the same exact thing as the Nintendo controller, but they added 2 more buttons. Everything is more angular, so you're not pressing the same button, but it has rounded edges instead of square edges, and I cannot tell you how more comfortable the Super Nintendo controller is compared directly to the Nintendo controller. This is just a smart idea, and I don't know if this is like an off-brand thing or if this was like a post-production. They started making them after the Super Nintendo started going away, but the color coded on the Super Nintendo controller was just really smart. It allowed developers to, in their games, color code images or like design assets in video games to correspond with something that was in the game and on the controller. Like, these meant something when you did this. The original Super Nintendo, if I'm remembering it correctly, the first one just had all purple features. Like, this is just 2 different shades of purple. But the color coding was a smart idea, and you could see that the controllers that carried on kept the color scheme thing going on. Like, it just made more symbolic sense. We're going to talk about the Genesis. Sega Genesis. This design is funky. I don't like for some reason Nintendo was like, we want to be able to do a couple more things in our video games, so we're going to add bumpers and then also a couple more face buttons. But they only did 2 face buttons and then 2 bumpers. Sega decided they wanted to follow suit. They wanted to do more things with their tech, but instead of just adding more, they added a lot of face buttons. Like, there is now 6 face buttons, which is the same amount of buttons that's on a Super Nintendo controller, except the Genesis doesn't have bumpers on them. The Genesis doesn't have a left and a right bumper. They just put all of their buttons right here on the right hand side of the controller. This is weird. I'm not entirely sure what the justification was behind it, but it also made it really easy to press other buttons while you were looking for specific ones. Like, you're blocking and let's say you're playing a fighting game or a game that just uses a defense mechanism, they put those right next to your utility buttons. So if you're trying to like push a box or you're trying to pick up an object or something, you're just gonna hit the block button instead. And sometimes that may be fine. Sometimes your block button also doubles up as your pick up a box button or whatever. But putting all of your buttons right here just means that your right thumb is putting in most of the work, and your other fingers are still just kind of sitting out. They're not doing anything. Whereas like this kind of engages your whole hand. This one doesn't. I'm gonna throw this Genesis in the D tier. It's fine. It's rounded, which is what we wanted, and you can see that they started taking the shape of a modern controller way earlier than anybody else, which I think is awesome. Sega had some sense in designing games and their peripherals, but they just never got to flesh them out because as soon as they innovated, somebody else came and did it better, which kind of sucks. Whatever, that's the industry. That's how you go about business. We're gonna move on to this is the 5th console generation. This is the one where video games actually hit the mainstream, and then everybody was playing video games. As with such, you had to have controllers that fit a better audience. So looking at here, we're going to start with the this is not Super Nintendo. This is the Nintendo 64. This thing is a goddamn classic. And unfortunately, it also has some classic 90s problems with trying to look cool while also provide utility. This is a weird ass controller. It has the 3rd prong here in the middle, which everybody will tell you, like, I don't know why it's there, but it just kind of exists. And I think the idea was that a player should be able to go back and forth between using the D-pad but then also using an analog stick. Like, some games you should just put one hand on this and one hand on the other one, and then you had all your buttons easily reachable from both fingers. But as far as I can recall, maybe like a very minor amount, like the minority amount of games had functionality like that, and they all just used the D-pad instead to move the characters. Yeah, there's some weird business going on then in the N64 controller, but what I do want to point out is that this was the jump from when we had just regular bricks to having actual pronged handles to hold on to, and that's really significant. Like the Sega SATURN controller hadn't quite gotten the memo yet, and so they still just kind of want a gamepad in your hand sort sort of thing going on, whereas like the prongs had officially decided to come out in the N64 and the PlayStation. So this kind of has the same issues that the Genesis had, where it just put a shit ton of face buttons on this side here. They have your standard D-pad and then your 4 face buttons over here, but then they had these special buttons that did stuff. These special buttons would be tied to like abilities or just additional functions that you would play in your video games, and it was very strange because they also included bumpers on the tops as well, so you just had an overabundance of buttons and you just kind of you had them. I remember specifically playing Ocarina of Time and Super Mario 64 on my older brother's N64, and if I went to go and press, I think it's the Y button, one of these two up here, it's just very easy to swing in and hit the A button or hit the green button or the blue one. It was just it was annoying to me as a kid because it was almost kind of works in reverse of these ones here. The mentality is that kids are going to be playing video games, so you make the controller small and simple, and then the 4th or 5th console generation shows up and then just introduces way bigger controllers with way more buttons. I'm going to throw this in the C tier because I think this is headed in the right direction. It's just we didn't quite understand efficiency in programming yet, so there's more buttons than there has to be. And also this fucking middle knob. If this was gone, this probably B tier controller. If this was gone, honestly. All right, let's move on to the Sega Saturn controller. This is basically just the Genesis controller, but with bumpers. Literally, like, they have the same 6 button face button thing here, but they added bumpers onto the Saturn controller. I don't know if that was on purpose. I don't know if they didn't anticipate that, but this kind of just, it didn't alleviate many of the problems that were had with the Genesis controller. Like, you still had all of your face buttons here, so you're accidentally hitting buttons when you're trying to reach for other buttons, but then they just added bumpers to it, so you still have to program what the fuck these things are going to do in your game, which is weird, but it's fine. It's typical. That's just video game nonsense stuff from the 90s, is that additional functionality that you don't really fucking need. I was just gonna but they added the bumpers. That's the big thing, is that the bumpers are important, and then also the shape is a lot better. Like, there's definitely more of a curve here for you to hold your hand and actually put your palm on the controllers, whereas like on these ones you're putting all of your fingers and your hands on the edge or behind of the controller, and that's just uncomfy. I don't know. I want to put this in the D tier because it's literally just the Genesis controller but with bumpers. That's all. That's all I can do with it. All right, we're gonna go for the DualShock 1. This is Sony's first console. This is the legendary PlayStation 1, where games shifted from cartridges to discs to CD-ROMs. And the very first control, this isn't even a DualShock. This is just a PlayStation 1 controller. I don't even remember what they called it. What did they call the first PS1 controller? The original just says it was made by Sony. It was model SCPH-1010 and was released alongside the PlayStation. So this is just the PlayStation controller. This is fine. Video games hadn't figured out the stick yet, so it's fine. I like it a lot. I think it feels weird when you're going back in time and you're used to analog sticks being the controller, literally controlling movement for every generation afterwards. The earliest ones are these simple face buttons here. It's so strange. It's so strange. So to know that the DualShock exists, which has this style on it, and then putting one out there without sticks on it, it feels like it's a bootleg. It feels like you're running a bootleg on the controller. I'm just gonna throw this one in probably C tier. C tier's good. I think if we're running this in terms of like comfortability, definitely this one's at the bottom. This one's at the top of D tier. These two are at the bottom here. This is how this should be. But PS1 controller, definitely in C tier. But if we're going to talk about the DualShock version of the PS1 controller, this one has the additional weight in it because it's using the analog sticks, but there's still not a ton, and like it has vibration. The original one doesn't have vibration, haptic anything. It's literally just the buttons. This adds vibration and DualShock compatibility to games that were programmed to run it. And for that, I'll throw it in the B tier. Like, look at it. It's a classic. All right, moving on. Sega Dreamcast. What the fuck is this thing? What the fuck is this thing? This thing is disgusting to look at, and it's even more disgusting to hold. I feel like all of the effort that made this controller should have just made a handheld console instead. Like, before its time, this could have been the Wii U, which granted didn't work out for Nintendo, but in, I don't know, the early 2000s, maybe it could have done something for Sega. This is just a little bit over-designed. You have your inner monitor here, which could relay information and certain data from your video games that you were playing. It's cool in concept, that's cool in theory, but it doesn't really work well with just how large it had to be because of it. You're holding a gamepad here, but the screen is too small, it wasn't backlit, and there was no second analog stick. The Dreamcast came out in the same console generation, but buckled under the weight of the other ones that came out immediately after it, which just immediately outperformed the Dreamcast. So one of the things you could tell immediately right away is that even the PS1 had dual analog sticks. The Dreamcast did not. It had the one for like movement, but it still relied on using bumpers and other face buttons to move cameras in its video games. It's huge. It's like, even compared to the OG Xbox controller, which is a tank. I don't remember how many of you guys remember holding an Xbox controller, but these things were massive, but they still felt good. Whereas this is, you're basically holding a giant plate. It did not feel good, and the technology was wasted in the monitor and the additional equipment inside. So I'm just going to throw that in the F tier and kind of forget that the Dreamcast exists, which I think Sega also likes to forget that it exists. All right, PS2 controller. This is just another classic because it's basically just the DualShock 1, but with additional equipment in it. So the vibration and haptic feedback was improved. The face buttons were lifted up away from the original a lot better. And all, if not most, games for the PS2 were programmed to have those functions from the beginning. Not every PS1 game came out with DualShock compatibility, so a lot of games just kind of fell through on the additional functionality that they provided. Whereas like the PS2 controller is everything that the DualShock 1 was, just better. But it also didn't change how the controller looked or felt. So the weight was more evenly distributed, so that way the whole controller felt heavy, whereas like the controller on the DualShock 1 was light in the grips but heavy on the front, if that makes sense. So if it were me, these two are basically equal. There's very little change between the two. The Nintendo GameCube controller, this one is tricky because it basically does everything right, because you were going from a bounce from the N64 to the GameCube. That's the comparison to make here. They got rid of the stupid fucking middle knob, which is awesome, but they wanted to fill your grip a little bit more by making you reach for these buttons. You're basically hold it like your fingers are going to be all the way up here with how they want you to hold this controller. It's strange. It's strange to look and it's strange to think about. They still put the knob up here because they want your hands to primarily touch this one. They finally made the transition from using the directional buttons to move, and they made it so that way the analog stick moves your character almost all the time, and then your D-pad is so small and you mainly use it to navigate menus. But then instead of just providing a second analog stick to like move a camera or what you're looking at or something like that, they made it this itty-bitty small thing, and then this is mainly used as additional mechanics. Like they want you to use these for when you're fighting, or if you're like racing or something like that, driving a vehicle. This analog stick is just not meant to be used the way other analog sticks are used, which is weird. It's just strange. And again, this controller is super top heavy. All of this is where the meat is of this controller is on the top here. This is pretty much, there's nothing in there. I don't know, it's lightweight, it's durable as heck. I could tell you that I broke a few PS1 controllers in my lifetime, never broke a GameCube controller. I'm gonna go ahead and throw, this is definitely an upgrade, but it's not quite on the same level as a PS1 PS1 or PS2 controller. The original Xbox, I made fun of this for being a tank earlier, but if I am speaking the God's honest truth, this thing is still a B tier controller. It's weighty, it fills out your grip in the correct way, okay? It doesn't just, it's not there for the sake of it, it fills out your grip in the correct way. So I would definitely give it points for that. All of the face buttons here serve a purpose. The only ones I call into question are these dumb black and white buttons. So in addition to the start and select, they wanted symmetry, I guess, so they put them over here. Why do these buttons exist? Why can't the functionality be used on the triggers, you know? A lot of games mainly just use these as like power-up buttons. There were a lot of games that I remember playing. I'm trying to think of one specifically, but like if you obtained a special weapon, or if you filled a meter or something and you press one of these buttons to activate it. In a lot of other games, in like PlayStation games or in Nintendo games, you held a combination of buttons, or you just used one of the face buttons to do that, or you press two buttons at the same time. Just that was how you do it. But Xbox deliberately had these buttons to use that for, and I think that's cool. I think that's really novel. I just call into question the black and white buttons all the fucking time. And then, like I said, there's a lot of surface area on an Xbox controller, so you're still reaching for a lot of these buttons to press. But I don't know, it's still good. It's weighty in the correct way. The haptic and the rumble and everything inside is really, really good too. It's a classic. They're also cheap as shit. The Xbox was specifically promoted to do couch co-op with like 4 players, and you could easily walk into a GameStop or a KB Toys or something and just buy 3 of these with a paycheck and have leftover money. Whereas like nowadays a fucking PS4 or PS5 controller is gonna cost you like $80 plus, depending on what color or what model you get. That shit's insane. All right, we're jumping into the next console generation here. This is the PS3, the Xbox 360, and the Wii. And I'm technically gonna include the Wii U because that was made as like a precursor to the next console generation, because it doesn't really fit into either category. We'll talk about the Wii U when I get there, but I'm gonna count these as the next console generation, starting with the PS3. PS3 is stupid. It has 2 controllers in it. So they didn't renew a contract, as far as I know, with the company that made the DualShock controllers. So they came out with what's called the SIXAXIS at first. And this is dookie. Like this is like a high F low D controller, and I'll tell you why. Is because they made it wireless. So all of the technology that provided the connectivity from the controller to the console was sitting in the controller first, and then when they made the consoles bigger and then realized that like there's no getting around having to make your consoles bigger, they just put all of this technology in the PS3. So all that was left in this controller was the shell, the analog stick function, and then a motion controller. There were certain games out there that you had to balance the controller to like balance your character or like stack objects or stuff like that. And that is the only technology in a 6-axis PS3 controller. So as a result, your controller is incredibly light. They got rid of the trigger guards on the bottom of the L2 and R2 buttons, so there was this weird like gap that you could pinch your fingers with underneath there. And overall, it didn't feel like there's anything in your hand. It just wasn't comfortable to hold. And I'll always hold that against the 6-axis. I fucking hate the 6-axis controller, but it just sits comfortably in your hand because it's the style of the PlayStation controller. So if it wasn't for that, this would be an F tier controller, definitely. I feel like they redeemed themselves with the wireless DualShock 3. This is nice. It's exactly the same as these two. It's just it's light controller because it's wireless, and they didn't really compensate for that. The technology is back in here to give it vibration and haptic feedback and everything into the controller. So it's heavier, which is nice, but it's still a wireless lanky controller that's too small now. Whereas before, like these ones fit snug comfortably in your hands. They also had these massive divots on the bottom here because of the analog sticks. All of that technology was refined and made smaller inside the controller, so it just didn't feel good to hold. If they had somehow made this controller feel a little meatier, then I'd probably like it a bit more, but because it doesn't, I don't like it as much. Now here we go. This is probably the true, like, this is the alpha. I'm having a hard time throwing it immediately in the S tier. This is probably the gold standard for modern controllers, if that makes sense. These two are standard across both. In fact, I'm probably just going to shoot this up into I'll shoot this one into the A. The PS2 and the Xbox 360 controllers are like unparalleled. The Xbox 360 controller fills out your hand. Your entire hand is going in here, and your thumbs can reach all of the fucking buttons. There's no unequal distribution of buttons on one side or with a stupid peg in the middle, or all of the controller buttons are on one side. All of them are easily reachable because of how long these controllers are designed. The buttons were in the right places. There's bumpers and triggers. You have a start and select button on either side. They're not down here in the middle, so you're not putting in extra work with your thumbs or like slipping off of a controller knob and hitting the start or select button or some shit. This is great. This is the ideal retro. The 6th and beyond, you're looking to replicate this baby. This thing is awesome. I love the Xbox 360 controller. It came in a wireless and a wired version, which I thought was funny. The wireless version basically just has a battery pack on the back, which I think is this thing's only flaw. The wired version doesn't give it enough weight. It becomes light and flimsy like a DualShock controller, but with the battery pack on, it feels the right amount of heft. The only downside is that you have to change the fucking battery. That seems really stupid to say out loud, but the Xbox 360 controller was awesome if you had a battery pack and two of battery packs, and one was charging all the time. It was just smart that way, and there were versions that you could change out like AA batteries on, which were stupid and wasteful and cost way too much money. But if you got a battery pack that you could just hook on a charger or something while you're not playing it, it's perfect. This is a really nice controller. All right, let's talk about the Wii. This was an experience. The Wii was a fucking experience, and I can't describe it any other way. The Wii by itself is kind of funny because all of the games are motion controlled. There wasn't a single Wii game that didn't try to promote motion functions in some way or another. You're either using it to move the camera, or you're using it to scout the area or something like that, or you're using it to balance objects that you're playing with. It was fun. The problem is it might have been a little too minimalistic, because the way you're holding it is your hand's either on this side or on this side, and your thumb is entirely up here. These buttons were basically object buttons, and you didn't have to worry about them. The reason that they have buttons down here was because certain games like Super Mario Brothers, or I think there was a Kirby game or whatever, they let you flip the controller so that way they're horizontal instead of vertical, and then suddenly these are action buttons. It's like you're all the way back in the fucking NES days or something. Your D-pad was over here, and you had a set of buttons right here that controlled your character, either by jumping or throwing or hitting something. It was interesting with what they did. If you only ever wanted to play Wii motion games, this was alright. This is a pretty neat controller. It's innovative, and I don't think people give Nintendo enough credit for how crazy fun the Wii was. They basically made everything better with the Nunchuck edition. This is their answer to people criticizing them for not having either a stick for precise movements, or just that second hand is doing something. If you're playing a game with just a Wiimote, your second hand is basically just hanging out, which is okay. It's fine. There were games that were just engineered around having a single controller to it, but it felt like you were missing something, and the Nunchuck is like that addition. It provides additional button inputs and something to do with your opposite hand. It's a really good addition. It's really neat, and I think that's all you gotta really say about the Nunchuck. Now let's talk about the Wii U. The Wii U is a frustrating sack of shit. There's not much else you can say about it. The controller itself, it's like good. It's basically just a DS. Like, it has a touchscreen which affected stuff that you were playing on your game. It gave you additional information when you needed it. It also gave you like mini games to play on this thing while stuff is happening on the big screen. They tried really hard to make it work, but the problem was they took the wrong lessons from the DS and applied it to console technology. The reason the DS was fun was because they put a monitor directly over the first monitor. So you're still given two different feeds of information, but on the Wii U, this is separate from your other monitor. Your TV is the first one, this is the second, and this one's in your hand on your lap while you're looking at the TV. So if shit's happening down here, you're not looking at the TV, and vice versa. And this is also something that they corrected, I guess you could call it, with the Switch that followed this, but your analog stick was way the heck up here. So your palm is right here, and you would accidentally press buttons, or you would press things in combination with each other that you didn't want. It was strange, but it's a precursor of what's to come. Again, I'll throw, because this is the controller, and this is the only thing that you would hold, and it was big, and it was heavy, and it was, I don't know. It's probably a D tier. It's a D tier controller. Because it's fine. It does what it's intended to do. It's just the functionality was bad. Alright, and now we are in PlayStation 4. This is the Xbox One, and this is the Switch. And there's a lot of Switch controllers, so let's try to get through this real quick. The PS4 controller is... it's strange. It's so weird. It's fine. It's fine. It's like a C. I don't like how long these handles are. And this is something that I complain about even now. After having been spoiled with these and the Xbox controller, is that they kind of took the wrong lessons from the jump from the DualShock 3 to, or sorry, from the SIXAXIS to the DualShock 3. All of the utility is right up here, but the way that you have to hold a controller with this one is that most of your fingers and your hand is down here, which means that your buttons and your fingers aren't touching all of the buttons the way they're supposed to be. You end up holding the controller up here, and then there's just kind of this dead space down here on the foot of the controllers. So this was definitely a weird one. This is very streamlined functionality. They replaced the start button with an options button, and then they replaced the select button with the share button. And then there's just a giant ass touchpad in the middle of the controller, and I think this isn't talked about enough. The DualShock 4 has all of the SIXAXIS and DualShock 3 stuff in it, so it weighs the right amount, and it weighs the right amount everywhere in the controller. And there's motion controller support. I don't know if you guys have ever played a PS4 game with motion controls in it, but it's actually pretty simple. It's pretty simple, and it's pretty fun. If you've ever played Infamous Second Son, they use the shit out of this entire controller. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend you playing it, but they make you play with the whole controller. It is definitely one of the games in the PS4's library that makes you like the whole controller. The problem is not enough other developers used the SIXAXIS to the best, like to the fullest extent of its abilities, I think. So there's a lot of technology in here that just goes unused, and I think that's kind of sad. Alright, the Xbox One controller is not a downgrade, it's more of like a side grade from the 360 controller because it kept the same lessons. It's just something that Xbox has been doing lately that's been pissing me the fuck off with the Xbox One and the Series controllers, is they're widening this gap. You see how there's kind of just this like little loop-de-loop right here at the bottom of a 360 controller, but in here it's a straight angle, and then it carries off like the entirety of the Xbox controller, and then it comes down again in this sharp angle. And I don't know what the fuck that's about. It's a strange design concept to put in here, but whereas like you felt like you could touch the entirety of a 360 controller, you can't really go as far and touch as much of the surface area on a Xbox One controller. The rest of it's pretty much the same though. The shoulder buttons are in funny places where like this was like directly on top of the Xbox controller, whereas like these ones are kind of starting to fall down the sides here, and I don't know if I like that as much. One thing I will give credit for though is that the 360 controller had your select, Xbox, home, and start buttons right in a row, and it was very easy to press another button while you were trying to go for one or the other, whereas this one kind of spaced it out and then moved the Xbox logo altogether. So I really appreciate that. It's just this weird angular thing making me feel like I can't hold as much of the controller. It feels bad. Alright, now let's bust out these Switch controllers because Jesus Christ is there a lot on the Switch. When you're holding your Switch, like the entirety of your Switch, it feels weird. It feels stressful because this is the whole console and this is your whole presentation. So if you fuck up any of this, if you drop any of this, it's just fucked. Like your Switch is going in the trash. That being said, it's weighty, it's heavy, and it feels appropriate. My only issue with holding the Switch all by itself is that this is your surface area to hold the Switch, is on either side of the Joy-Con. If you are not playing with the controllers here, you are putting all of your fingers on the back of the Switch LCD itself, and that can get kind of uncomfortable because then you're putting a lot of weight on the inside of your palms, like where your thumbs are, and you might end up, you know, crunching it, holding the buttons the wrong way or something like that. Maybe your thumb doesn't sit comfortably on the bottom part of this, but it sits better on the top part of the other one. I don't know. To me, it's just weird to hold your Switch all at the same time, and maybe that's because I got small hands or something. I don't fucking know. But if I were to put the Switch by itself on here, I'm gonna say it's comfortable to hold, but it could be better. Definitely an upgrade over the Wii-U because this is thin and streamlined, whereas it felt like I was holding a brick for the Wii-U. So Switch is just better in every way, and I definitely say it's a lot more comfortable than holding these ones. Now, if we're holding just the Joy-Cons themselves, it's weird. I don't like it. I don't like holding the Joy-Cons by themselves. And it's the exact opposite. This feels really big. These just feel small and dinky. And they want you to hold these like you're holding a PlayStation controller. Or even, I won't even say an Xbox. They're definitely mimicking like the style, the shape of holding a PlayStation controller. But they want you to hold two at the same time when they're side by side. Like if you're not holding them up and down to play games with each other. If you're holding them up and down, they feel like a Wii controller. But they don't have that additional functionality that a Wii controller provides. It's just awkward holding a Joy-Con. They're too small. If it was a little bit bigger, if they made them bigger like a Switch or a Wii controller, they'd probably be fine, but they're just too small for any good functionality. The gamepad, or I don't know, joypad? I don't know what you would call this contraption, but this is typically how I play my Switch, is I dock my Switch and I play with a controller pad. It's very rarely that I take my Switch out on road trips and stuff, so I don't have a lot of opportunities to play it like this. This is typically how I play my Switch, and this is fine. Because it's multiple pieces, it had to be very effective in where the controller parts sat, and I think that's where a lot of the effort goes. So the controllers themselves are fine sitting in there. The handlebars that you have to hold are pretty uncomfortable. They don't have any rubber grip or anything like that. They're basically just two prongs of plastic. They're made not of the same material as the Joy-Con, so it's very, very different, and you can tell that you're not holding a Joy-Con. They kind of fixed it, kind of, with this thing. This is also just fine. The material is bad in the base one. All they did was make this beveled plastic stuff to let you know that like you're gripping where you're supposed to be holding. And the buttons are cloned in the exact same placement as an Xbox controller, so it's not really that big a difference from, I want to say, like, I don't know, probably the Series or the Xbox One controllers. They're okay, they're alright. All of their weight's on the top, they just got these stupid handles on the bottom, that's all. And the Switch Lite. I'm going to go ahead and put this down here because it's basically all of the issues that I have with holding your Switch, just exacerbated because it has a smaller build. It's everything that's wrong that I don't like about the Switch controller, just magnified to a degree because it has a smaller frame on it, and also the screen is smaller. That saying, the Switch Lite does a lot for the Switch. It's basically everything you like about the Switch. It has all the same processing power, you can play the same games on it, you just can't dock the thing, and it's a smaller hold. So if you have big hands, that might be a problem for you, but I didn't have an issue with it. Alright, and finally, all we have left is the DualSense and the Xbox Series controllers. These are pretty difficult to match. I like both of these controllers a lot. I know that we're kind of spoiled in today's day and age because we have these massive controllers with a massive amount of technology in them, but it's basically, this is like the new prime standard is this new style of controller. They're really huge frames, so your hands sit comfortably on the sides of them, and that's the most important part. The only difference between this is the angle at which the handles come down. DualSense is a lot more vertical. If I am going to be honest about it, I think the DualSense controller is the best controller we have ever gotten for a video game console. I'm going to throw the Series controller in the B tier with the other ones because all of the problems I had with the Xbox One controller, I still have with the Series controller. The face is just about as big as a DualSense, which I think is awesome. That is like the way needs to go. There's a lot of surface area which spreads out your hands, but also gives the ability to put haptic sensors and motion sensors around the entire controller, not just in like the top and the middle or whatever. It also lets you press certain buttons definitively instead of just slipping into other buttons like the Xbox 360 or the JOYCONs. And there's still a gigantic touchpad. That is just something that's not in these other controllers, is that they add an additional layer for developers to do something innovative with their video games by giving you these additional steps here. And I think that's really fun. You have resistant triggers that let you, that like in Spider-Man, when you're trying to thwip something and it just doesn't quite pull or something like that, it resists on the triggers. The touchpad is used when you're like uncovering items or maps or something like that, and you can just feel your way around them. I think that's really cool. I think that's really special, and it's super comfortable. Just holding this controller is super comfortable. The Xbox controllers haven't quite figured it out yet, but these come down a little bit. They're straight, and then they come down narrower faster, whereas like these ones have that ass behind them, and it still forces your hands to sit uncomfortably on this really wide base for no reason. So yeah, this has to be my favorite, like the best controller that I've ever put my hands on. If I were to sit back and just hold the DualSense controller all day, I would be happy. Whereas like I'm gonna get pissed off pressing a lot of buttons that are close together on an Xbox One or in a 360 controller. I'm gonna mistakenly press buttons on a fucking Joy-Con when I'm trying to play Mario Party. Or my hands are just gonna get tired of being poked when I'm holding like an old retro fucking Nintendo controller or something. So yeah, I think this is right. Alrighty guys, take it all in. Here we go. This is Meganimanics definitive tier list on video game controllers. This is where I sit in our day and age, and I haven't really found or held anything that has changed my mind about that. If something else new comes along, like if a Super Pro controller comes out and I test it and I figure that it just feels better or blows everything else out of the water, then I'll rearrange my statements, or maybe somebody can convince me about changing something on this list. But if I'm being honest, this is what I came up with now. If any of you agree or disagree, definitely let me know by commenting down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I love to talk about video games, so I'm sure that there's some stories that somebody has about breaking a controller or you know, changing your console preference entirely just because you've held a controller too long and you didn't like the way it felt anymore. So yeah, let's talk about video games and video game controllers. Thanks again for watching, everybody. I appreciate each and every single one of you. Leave a like on this video if you liked what you saw, and that's about all I have for today, so I'm gonna get the heck out of here. Don't forget to stay awesome, be kind, and rewind, and I'll see you in the next one. Excelsior!